Well, it's good to meet you, Jenny Etnier. And what drew me to your work is that you're looking at movement across the lifespan, looking at everything from as older adults, how movement can help us in terms of our cognition. But then you also have this whole line of interest in kids and how to get kids moving and the benefits of movement and physical activity from an early age, and also the role as a coach and how coaches play a role in that. So I love that because many of us maybe have a relationship with movement that either we didn't develop as kids, or maybe we felt pressured as kids to move in certain ways, or now that we're adults, we wish we could get back to how we used to be when we were kids, and now it just feels like a boring treadmill at the gym. So my first question for you is, how have you moved your body today?
Oh, that's great. Yeah. I'm fortunate. I live in North Carolina, and oftentimes the weather is such that I can ride my bike to work. I wasn't able to do that today, but I did get out with my dogs this morning and got about a 35-minute walk in this morning before starting my day. But I should say, Diana, thank you for that introduction. That's such a holistic approach to an introduction. I really appreciate it. It makes me excited to have this conversation with you for the next little while.
Yeah, and maybe that's also what we need in our approach to movement, is more of a holistic approach, because it's been, for a long time, it was sort of put aside as it's something that we do to lose weight or change our body in certain ways. But when we were kids, it was something that we loved. And then for some of our kids turned into sport. And then for some of our kids that turned into stress. I loved your New York Times article on coaches and what coaches are doing wrong. So let's start with movement in childhood, and then we can work our way into adulthood and some of your cutting edge research in terms of cognition and movement.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so you're bringing up a lot of neat things. I mean, I do have a lot of different aspects to what I'm interested in. The work that I do on a daily basis is research, scholarship, science, trying to understand better how exercise can be used as a way to benefit cognitive outcomes. That's what I'm typically interested in. But because I have a background in sport, and because I have kids who have participated in sport, and because I am a huge physical activity advocate, you're exactly right that it also transcends into other work that I do that is really focused on trying to improve the youth sport experience with a goal of making it positive for all kids, so that in the long term, they'll end up staying actively engaged in some sort of physical activity as they move into young adulthood, middle-aged, and older age.
So where is it going wrong? What's not making it positive? I've certainly experienced it personally with my two boys.
Yeah. I think it's really a shame the way that the folks who have the privilege of working with our kids in a youth sport environment, sometimes I think forget the reason that they came out to the field or the gym or the swimming pool or whatever it is in the first place. And typically, if you ask people who are engaged in coaching, they'll tell you that they want to give back to the sport. They want to give back to the game. They want to recreate the love for the sport in other kids, the same as what they might have experienced. And so all of their intentions are really, really positive. But then oftentimes I think something just goes wrong when the motivation starts to shift to wanting outcomes, victories, wins, goals, whatever it might be, that aren't necessarily consistent with making sure that the children have the best sport experience they possibly can.
Yeah, and there's also this specialization that happens really early.
Yeah.
So, if a kid is 10 years old and they haven't started playing soccer yet, sorry, you missed your window. Right? That's how some families feel, like that you had to start at 5 or 6. And a lot of times kids don't know what they want to do, or they just want to try out certain things, or maybe they're not interested at 6, but they do become more interested at 12. But if you're going to start baseball at 12, that's going to be pretty embarrassing to stand up there with all these other ball players that know how to swing at a ball. So that's a real problem, because it really limits kids' exploration of movement in their bodies and enjoyment in diverse physical activity.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think you're exactly right, because most sports are now, they use different names, but essentially it's club organizations. And, in those clubs, I've seen before that they'll show you sort of the triangle of how you're going to move up from rec, and you're going to go through these levels, and eventually you'll be in this tiny little triangle where you're in the elite. And I just keep thinking, why do sports clubs have that as their model? Why isn't it a square? Or why doesn't it get bigger as you go up, right? If you can bring 100,000 kids in to play soccer, shouldn't our goal be that 100,000 kids are still playing soccer in 5 years? Why would we want to pare that down to the kids who are considered elite and therefore are the only ones that the clubs want to focus their energy on? It's completely incompatible with goals related to a healthy lifestyle. It's completely incompatible with viewing children as holistic young people who should have the right to explore different types of sports, exactly like you're talking about, Diana, through their youth and maybe even into adolescence and young adulthood.
And I want to, I'm kind of hearing the, maybe the voices in my head that of other parents that would say, yes, but it's important to learn how to compete. And we don't want to give gold stars and awards to every single kid. I also want to say that you are an elite athlete. You played professional soccer?
I mean, elite's probably a stretch, Diana.
Well, comparatively, you're more elite than I am.
This was a few decades ago, and I had some opportunities to play soccer at a pretty high level, but I wouldn't consider myself elite. But I do consider myself to really love a lot of sports and to be pretty good in a ton of different venues, whether it's racket sports or team sports. I'll try anything and still enjoy trying anything. And I think that's because of a different attitude, not because of not wanting to specialize completely early and wanting to try and stay active in a lot of different games, which should all be fun, right?
Yeah. Well, let's talk about some of the benefits of physical activity for kids and beyond just being able to be an elite athlete and make the team that they want to make for high school or college. There's psychological benefits. There's leadership benefits. There's how to play on a team. And then there's also physiological benefits in terms of their cognition and their learning that is really essential. One of the takeaways that I had from reading some of your research is that if my kid is going to take a test, it's a good idea to study and then go exercise and then take the test, or exercise and then study and then take the test. That it actually has just a single session of movement for these kids can make a difference in terms of their academic achievement and the way that they think. So tell us a little bit about that, the benefits of exercise.
Hi, I'm Dr. Diana Hill. Thank you so much for joining me with Your Life in Process. And if you want more, if you're interested in applying these processes to your daily life, join me at my membership, More Life in Process. At More Life in Process, you will get meditations for you to practice at home. You'll get extra bits from the episode that maybe got recorded after the fact. You're going to get PDFs and handouts, things that you can use to apply your daily practice to your life. And I can't wait to see you there. $5 a month, $50 for the year. You can go to yourlifeinprocess.com to sign up.
And so it's a great place to start. So if we start by thinking about what a single session of exercise has the potential to do, what we know from a pretty robust body of evidence is that a single session of exercise can help you perform better cognitively. Now, that's sort of a hard thing to unpack, right? Like, what does that exactly mean? I think that it means a lot of different things, and they do relate to the way that our kids perform in the classroom. So if a child has been physically active and they're then able to pay attention better in class, then that's going to benefit them academically. If they've been physically active and they can remember things better, that's going to benefit them. If they can do things that relate to executive control, which is a pretty hot topic for a lot of different reasons, but executive control is sort of inhibiting things we don't want to happen and being able to really focus in on the things that we want to happen. It's working memory, being able to manipulate items within our memory as we're being asked to do some sort of a task. All of these things you could see would have a real direct link to how a student might do in a classroom. Now, as you're probably well aware, across our country, physical education has really been dramatically reduced during the school day. And so the opportunity for kids to be physically active during the day has been really dramatically reduced. And I have concerns that that impacts their ability to be successful in the classroom. Most kids are not going to get up an hour early so they can go exercise. before they start their day, right? Some do. Now, and that's interesting to think about. People who are on swim teams is one of the best examples, I think, of athletes who get up prior to school and go work out before the day begins. And so they're an interesting group to consider. But most kids, we're hoping that they'll get physical activity during the day. And unfortunately, that's not really happening. Physical education has been pulled. Recess in some places has been pulled. Recess in some places is so limited from either a space perspective or a supervision perspective that kids aren't moving around. Even though they have that opportunity, they're not taking it. It's completely counter to those robust body of evidence that shows that exercising for 20 to 30 minutes at a moderate intensity can then benefit your cognitive performance in the short term. And what you were alluding to, Diana, it can impact your memory in the longer term. So if you're physically active before you study for a test, that's going to benefit your retention 24 hours later, we would expect. So yeah, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that a single session can make a difference. And not just for kids. You mentioned the lifespan approach, not just for kids, but that might be where it's, seems particularly relevant because of how they're spending their day.
Yeah, and some of the solutions to kids that are struggling academically is that they need to spend some extra time on their academics, where maybe a solution to a kid that's struggling academically would be maybe they need to go out for an hour or half an hour and just run it out and play a good game of ball, and then maybe come back in and they'll be in a different focused state. I teach yoga in my kids' school, and I can kind of get a read based on how wiggly the kids are in terms of how intense I'm going to make the yoga class. So if it's the end of the day and they're super wiggly and they're not paying attention and they're just all over the place, then we're doing like frog jumps, like 20 frog jumps and spinning around, and then making them hold really difficult balance poses and doing really intense, quick sun salutations because they need it. I can tell they've just been focused for the last, hour and a half on social studies or whatever. And that it is something that when we help our kids start to notice their need for movement and the benefit of movement, then it translates into later in life as something that you feel like you want to do and that you look forward to doing. And for many, many adults, that's not their relationship with physical activity. They feel it's a should, it's a must, it's boring. They don't have enough time for it, in the same way that there's not enough time for kids to have PE, so we'll just take it out. Adults do that too. There's not enough time for me to go to the gym, so I just take it out. So what's your response to that? When we start to look at later on in life, you're in your 40s, your 50s, your life is busy, and you're still like, well, maybe, I'll put that off and do the other more important things first.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, and you may already know this, Diana, but it's ironic that we find that the people who do fit exercise into their day actually objectively have more commitments. Ooh. So it's not I would, this might be a little bit too strong, but I would say that we all have time to fit it into our day.
That's right.
The question is, do we prioritize it? And so the folks who make physical activity a part of their routine, who prioritize it and make sure that they have time reserved to be physically active, fit it in despite having equal or more commitments than the people who say they don't have enough time to be physically active. So I think it's partly just making it a priority, figuring out a time of day when it works for you to be active. So I mentioned a lot of times I can ride my bicycle to work. That's great. I can really make sense of it because it takes me an hour to ride to and from, but it would take me 30 minutes to drive to and from plus 30 minutes to walk. So it's the same total time. But now because I've made it my transportation, it's part of what I'm doing, Mm-hmm. But because I couldn't ride my bicycle today, then I have to make sure that I have time in the day to get a walk in. And for people who regularly exercise, the other thing that I think is important to think about is that on a day when they don't exercise, they often feel bad. So the exercise, when you get used to it and it becomes a part of your day, gives you a feel-good benefit for the day, but also you miss it when you can't do it, if there's some reason you can't do it. And so that then motivates you to continue doing it. So it can become a really positive cycle for people who can make that initial commitment, get out there and exercise. If you've been sedentary to date, try to make it a regular part of your routine. Try to write it into your calendar. commit to it. And after a while, you'll start to look forward to it. You'll start to notice the real benefits of it. And you'll start to not feel as happy when you're not able to do it.
Mm-hmm. So there's a couple of things that you've done there in terms of making it a habit for you. And I see this in folks that are successful with movement is you pair it with something else that you're already going to do, whether that's pairing it with a commitment to, meet somebody somewhere for a class, or it's pairing it with your morning routine with taking your dogs out, or it becomes a habit. Another thing that you're doing is you are associating exercise with positive feelings as opposed to shoulds or expectations. It's like, this feels good. This is something I want to do as opposed to something I have to do. And tracing back to kids and sport, that's often the switch that gets flipped because it turns from a want to into a have to when we're over focused on these outcome-based measures as opposed to the process. And the process of exercise in itself can be enjoyable, or moving your body can be enjoyable. And you have to find the things that are enjoyable to you. And having, I also hear in there a diversity of options, because if you're only a swimmer and it's a cold day, you're just not going to swim.
So we have indoor pools in North Carolina, Diana.
Oh, yeah, we don't have that.
Maybe different than California.
Here you're just cold. We don't have temperature regulation here in Santa Barbara. So tell us, I want to hear more about what you're doing in science in terms of cognition exercise, because that can be a big motivator for folks when you start to have other reasons to exercise besides it's quote good for me or I'm going to lose weight. Those are, a little bit more diffuse than thinking about other types of benefits like your cognitive benefits. Tell us about your research in Alzheimer's and what you're doing right now.
Yeah, sure. So right now, I'm really excited to share with your audience that we're in our last year of a really large clinical trial that's been funded by the National Institutes of Health. And we're looking at the cognitive benefits of a 1-year exercise program for people who are currently cognitively normal. So going about their business. They're 40 to 65 years of age. They don't have any memory complaints, no cognitive concerns, nothing like that. But they have a family history of Alzheimer's disease. And so we've recruited 180 people who are currently sedentary or not meeting the national guidelines for being physically active to come into the study. And they do about 3 hours of cognitive testing at the pretest. We do MRI scans and collect structural data and resting functional data using neuroimaging. We get blood samples so that we can look at biomarkers that might be relevant to Alzheimer's, might be impacted by exercise, might be important for cognition. And then we're also getting a saliva sample so that we can assess their genetic risk for Alzheimer's disease. And after that, we randomly assign them to either maintain their normal lifestyle or to enter into an exercise program for a year. The exercise program before 2020 was a face-to-face exercise program. But as you can imagine, we had to switch to a virtual exercise program after that. And that's what we've stuck with since the pandemic.
And is that cardio stuff? Is it on machines? Is it walking? Is it weights?
It's both. So it's they're asked to do their walking on their own for 30 minutes a day, 3 times a week as a minimum. And then they're asked to do strength training with us 3 times a week for 30 minutes a day. It's 30 to 40 minutes a day. We go through a series of routines with TheraBands.
The TheraBand, it's so portable. You can do it at a park. It's like the best. Yeah.
And it's so easy to progress, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you just need the different weights of bands, or you can double them if you get to that point or whatever. But so we're just starting to look at some of the data. We've got a complete set of baseline or pretest data. So we've got all 180 people have been pretested. We don't have everybody's genetic information yet, but eventually we'll know if people have the highest genetic risk for Alzheimer's, or they're somewhere in the middle, or they have the lowest genetic risk for Alzheimer's. And what we're interested in seeing is if there are any relationships at the pretest that differ as a function of their genetic risk. What we're already starting to see, and this, I think this is, how do I say this? This is disturbing. In 40 to 65-year-olds who are cognitively normal, they're all sedentary. But the ones who are the most sedentary, if we sort of split them in half and say, okay, you're all sedentary, but some of you are really sedentary, and some of you are at least getting a little bit of activity. The ones who are really sedentary perform worse on a lot of cognitive tests than the ones who are just a tiny bit active.
Yeah.
So that suggests that being just a tiny bit active is helping, right?
Yeah.
We also see that those who have the greatest genetic risk for Alzheimer's are showing some, not as many, but there are some cognitive tests where we can see some subtle differences in performance already.
Mm-hmm.
They have a family history of Alzheimer's. We're all aging, right? But the genetic risk for Alzheimer's is perhaps driving some subtle beginning differences in cognition that could manifest in the future as more severe differences. And that's the biggest reason I'm really excited about this study. I don't know of any other study that's looking at such a young age group and an exercise intervention relative to protecting against Alzheimer's.
Right.
There's reason to suspect that once people start having some of the neurofibrillary tangles and the plaques in the brain, that it would be harder to use a behavioral intervention like exercise to protect them.
Right.
So what our thinking is that by starting with a younger age group, that the exercise at this time could have an impact that might be much more meaningful because they're pre any signs of dementia.
Right.
Right. As far as we know, they're pre any signs of dementia. And so we're thinking that it's, we all know that the brain is plastic. We all know that it's malleable. We're thinking that this might be a window of opportunity where exercise could make a really big difference, particularly for the people who have a family history of Alzheimer's and a genetic risk for Alzheimer's that is, that's pretty scary.
Yeah. And if you have a family history of Alzheimer's or you've experienced an elder that has gone through dementia, you're pretty motivated to not have that, be the course of your future if you can make that happen. So what is happening at the structural level and the mechanistic level in the brain? Like why is exercise making this difference, in terms of our cognition and our brain health?
Yeah, there's a whole host of things that are happening. And so what we see, most studies that are done focus on one area or the other. So they might be looking at neuroimaging measures. There are some that have used PET scans. They might be using behavioral measures. They might be using, measuring biomarkers. So people are looking at different places. There's not that many that are very comprehensive. And so the reason I say that is because that means that the exercise interventions can be pretty variable, right? So one study might have done 6 months. One study might have done 3 months. A study might have done a year. This study was looking at neuroimaging. This study was looking at brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which we measure in the blood. It's a host of things. But what I would say in a general sense is that, as you might expect, if you stimulate the body with as big of a physiological stimulus as exercise is, a host of things happen in the brain. And if you do that on a regular basis so that the body is increasingly, you can think of it as fitness, but it's increasingly sensitive to the exercise and increasingly responsive, and you're starting to get these enduring benefits, then you can imagine that would have big long-term effects. And so what we see is that we see changes in the hippocampus, right, which is one of the first areas that's implicated in Alzheimer's disease, but we see increases in hippocampal volume in response to exercise. We see changes in brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which the way I think of neurotrophic factors is that they're sort of like miracle grow for neurons. So when it's present, the neurons are able to sort of grow and the synapses are able to form, and it results in neurogenesis.
That's why you're doing better on your test, because your neurons got more connected from studying. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And so there's some evidence to suggest that brain-derived neurotrophic factor or other neurotrophic factors are implicated. There's some very early evidence that's suggesting that exercise could have an impact on the amyloid beta plaques and on tau, which is what creates the neurofibrillary tangles in Alzheimer's disease. I'm hoping that when we start to look at our pre to post or even pre to 6 month measures, we'll start to be able to look at some of those questions in our sample. We'll probably be able to start looking at the 6 month data any minute now. And then we've got a group that's wrapping up their post-test right now. We have a group that's post-testing in May and a group that's post-testing next September. So by this time next year, we'll have all of our data for the full year intervention and be able to really start to look at some of these questions closely.
Yeah. So how are you getting these people to exercise for a year?
most people drop out of exercise, within 6 months. I think it's like 50% of people drop out of exercise programs within 6 months of starting. Obviously, they're motivated to be part of this study, but not everyone's going to be in a research study. They may have the idea, oh, I would like to, be able to change my brain and have better cognition and have all this great longevity benefits. But the reality is it's hard to keep that going for a year. So what's the secret there?
Well, I mean, I think you hit on it already when you said that the folks who have a family history of Alzheimer's and might have seen somebody suffer the effects of that disease is going to recognize that if there's anything they can do that would help, that they should probably do it, that would limit their likelihood of becoming demented themselves, that they should do it. So I think our participants, I know for a fact, we ask them, and they will tell you two things. One, they've seen Alzheimer's in action, and they want to do anything that they can to help contribute to our understanding of how to prevent it.
Yeah.
And two is, I myself am personally at risk because I have a family history, and so I'm very motivated to exercise. The third thing that happens for us, the exercise is done in a group setting. And so even though it's virtual, there are still relationships that are formed. And it essentially works in some ways like an Alzheimer's support group. So, I mean, that's not the focus, but we might meet with the exercise instructor. They'll be there for 30 minutes, but 15 minutes before that starts and 15 minutes afterwards, we leave the Zoom session open so that people can interact. Because I think that's a really important part of what they get out of our program as well, and is something that draws them to continue to come to the exercise program. Just to have the chance to talk to somebody who's been through it. If you've lost a parent to Alzheimer's or a relative or a friend, it's really helpful to be able to talk to somebody else who's either in the caregiving realm right now or has experienced that loss already.
Yeah, so there's this side effect of the social connection that's happening there, and whether you're connecting around something like loss, or for some folks, what keeps them moving is they're just they have a regular tennis group that they like to go and chat with their friends at, or they have, my mom's been walking with the same best friend since I was in junior high. Saturday mornings, she walks with Patty.
That's so cool.
Now they're well into their 70s, right? They used to be in their 40s. I mean, this is like 30 years of walking together and the relationship that's been built around that. One of the future research topics that I heard you talk about is also this idea that what if there's cognitive benefits to exercise, but what if we also exercise in a way that's cognitively beneficial? Such as exercising in a social group, or exercising in nature, or exercising while listening to a podcast, that you may be able to get a double benefit versus just being on a Stairmaster for 45 minutes alone, staring at a wall or watching a lame show.
I mean, we don't know much about that. There's a few studies that have been done, but most of them, even though in the title of the paper, it'll say they're looking at exercise and cognitive engagement together. Typically, what they do is 30 minutes of exercise and then 30 minutes of cognitive engagement, separate things. So it's not simultaneous, it's asynchronous. I think exactly what you're getting at, Diana, is really important to think about the benefits of synchronous exercise and cognitive engagement. Is there a difference between walking on your treadmill, like you said, doing nothing, or doing something very passive like watching television, versus walking with a friend and having on a conversation where you're having to listen, you're using your memory, you're paying attention to what they're saying so that you can, provide an appropriate response, versus things that are really engaging, but I don't know for sure the benefits that they'd have, but some kinds of e-gaming things, right? There's one that I did a long time ago, and I can't remember the name of it, but essentially when you were riding on this stationary cycle, what you were doing was making your little avatar on the screen ride on its cycle, and you could race other avatars on the screen. And I mean, I was dripping with sweat because I enjoyed the competition. I enjoyed the scenery of going through mountains, even though I was sitting on a stationary ergometer, right? Mm-hmm. And it was cognitively engaging, but in a different way than maybe a conversation, in a different way than listening to a podcast where you're having to follow a conversation, And so I think that's something that would be really fascinating for us to learn more about.
That's also what sport does, right? When you're engaging in a sport, you're mentally engaged. I mean, whether that's on the basketball court or you're surfing or you're playing, like you are in a state of flow in part because not only you're physically engaged, but mentally you're fully present and challenged.
Yeah, and I was going to bring up, there's other forms of things that we think of not as sport, but as physical activity, like dance, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like Tai Chi or Qigong. So there's a lot of different ways that you can move and be cognitively engaged that are different than walking on a treadmill. And they may have additional benefits in terms of cognitive outcomes or maybe mental health outcomes as well.
So we've been talking a lot about exercise, and it seems that most of the research that's done is done on this 30 minutes of physical activity, 30 minutes of walking, 30 minutes of strength training. And the way in which I approach movement in my life is very different than 30 minutes of movement and then sit all day. I've gotten really interested in more nutritious movement, of how we bring movement in our day throughout our day, not just a single bout of exercise and then sedentarism throughout the rest of the day. And I really like Katie Bowman's approach to a movement diet, where she'll talk about, like, you wouldn't necessarily want just one thing. You wouldn't want just eat kale all day and think you got all your nutrients. There's a movement diet, has a lot of diversity in it, moving your body in different ways, moving your body nutritiously throughout your day. Is there research into that in terms of the difference between movement versus physical activity? I know we need both, but what are the benefits there of these two different?
I mean, as you can imagine, Diana, it's really hard to study the more broad types of behaviors that you're talking about, where they happen through the entire day and they're not prescripted. They're as you figure out how to work it into your life. Mm-hmm. It would be really hard to prescribe it and study it in a scientific way, right? Like, I'm going to say, Diana, I want you to accumulate 120 minutes of physical activity today, but I want you to do it 5 minutes this hour, 10 minutes that hour, 5 minutes that hour. Like, I couldn't do it in a really tightly controlled scientific study. So unfortunately, the answer is that we don't know much about that type of movement. And I think, from my perspective, we know a lot about how exercise benefits cognition, but we still don't know a lot. And so we have to start with standard prescription, standard doses. That's what I'm really looking for. Standard doses to explore until we understand better, the mechanisms, and we understand better for whom the benefits are clearly observable. Once we do that, then I think we can start to expand our ability to try to understand exactly what type of exercise would be the best. I think it could get complicated further by the fact that there could be individual differences in what type of exercise is the best, right? So, it may be that for some people, an hour of exercise in one chunk is better physiologically, or just is better for their personality because they can adhere to it, mm-hmm. right? Whereas for somebody else, they might be like, well, I can work it in these ways throughout my day, but I never have a full hour. And so I'm going to work it in these days. And they might be able to adhere to that better. And who knows, they might also benefit just as much or more or differently than the person who did it all in an hour, as an example.
Right. The best movement or exercise is the sustainable one, right?
That's exactly right.
So we start there. Like, what is it that you are going to be able to do and sustain from childhood to midlife to into your 80s and 90s and beyond? I mean, that's really the goal there, is that it's not something that you do for 30 days and then you're done with, that this is a lifestyle of movement.
Yeah.
And what does the research show about that in terms of what are the key factors in helping people sustain movement across the lifespan?
Ooh, across the lifespan. Wow. That's a good way to put it. I mean, usually we're looking at a shorter time frame, right? So as you mentioned, in the studies that are looking at behavioral change, they would usually be considering 6 months to be sort of the target, because if you can get people through to 6 months, mm-hmm. then there's evidence that makes us think that it's more of a habit that people will be able to sustain from that point forward. But to think about it across a lifetime, I don't know that I've seen anything like that. If you ask the physical educators, right, then they would say, well, we need to teach people the skills, the fundamental movement skills, the lifetime physical activity skills that allow them choices as they go through age and their interests change. And so from that standpoint, I think that makes really good sense, right? So if we can teach our children, and you've circled it back in a beautiful way, Diana, because if we have kids specialize, you mentioned that you've got children who are playing baseball. If they're specializing in baseball, but they don't make the high school team, or they make the high school team, but they don't play in college, then what physical activity are they going to do? What else do they know how to do? And your kids are growing up in California. There's a lot of opportunity for outdoor activities. And so I imagine that's what you would hope, that they're mountain biking, walking, cycling, other types of things that they're doing are the ones that are going to stick with them through their lifetime, and that they'll be able to adapt to different stages in their life where they have different responsibilities. They live in different parts of the country. They might live in a city instead of living in a setting where it's easy to get outside, and so I think the physical educators have it right when they have an interest in making sure that our kids grow up having solid fundamental movement skills that allow them to pick up tennis, or to pick up pickleball, or to pick up mountain biking, or to pick up volleyball, in a recreational adult league. Those types of activities that provide social engagement, provide a chance to meet people, provide a commitment to other people because you're on a team or you have a walking partner, and then they can also adapt with time.
And I would say as a clinical psychologist, having a positive experience with those activities will increase the chances of you doing them again. Yeah. It's like basic behavioral reinforcement here. So if you have positive memories of playing basketball with friends, then when you're 20s and 30s, you may pick up a game, or even in your 40s and 50s, you may pick up a game, or you may get out on the court with your kid. And that's where, again, this idea of positive experiences, something that you look forward to, something that you enjoy, is such an important part of this lifespan of being a mover. And then having, lots of different options, because sometimes life doesn't always go our way, or we get injured. And, you have a knee injury, you're not going to be running or playing tennis for a while. What are you going to do instead? So that's a really important thing too.
We recently started using this scale that's called, there's several different versions, but we're using a kinesiophobia scale. And it's not exactly how it sounds. It's not fear of being physically active, but it's more like a personality trait kind of a measure of, to what extent do you look for opportunities to be active during the day as opposed to avoiding them? So like a question might be, would you go to the grocery store? Are you looking for the closest parking spot or the spot the furthest away? Because when I go, I'm looking the furthest away because I want to get in those extra steps. I don't have to have the closest spot. I don't have to have that anxiety of looking for the closest spot, right? It's been a long time for me since my kids were little, but at the time when I would be heating like formula in the microwave for them, I distinctly remember thinking, oh my gosh, I have a whole minute. Like, what can I accomplish? And when you have young kids, your time is precious. But it was it was from a physically active standpoint. Like, what can I put away? What laundry can I fold? I've still got 30 seconds. Like, I can get more stuff done. And so I guess what I'm thinking is that what you're talking about, Diana, with helping people to find the joy and the fun in moving is, to me, the responsibility of the parents and the physical educators and the community and the coaches and all of us, so that we help develop young people who find joy in moving in whatever form that might be. And then because of that, they have positive experiences. And because of that, they develop competencies and confidence. And because of that, when they go to their first job after college or their first job after high school, and they're in a new city and they want to figure out how to meet new people, they can say, well, I'm going to join, a flag football team, or I'm going to join a city softball team, or I'm going to join a tennis club, right? Mm-hmm. And that gives them a nice way to meet new people and to stay physically active in whatever situation they find themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems that combination of finding the joy in movement and then the other part of it that your Alzheimer's prevention program is highlighting, which is finding the meaning in it, mm-hmm. and being able to pull that longer term, 20 years down the road, how do I want to feel in my body? What things do I want to be physically able to do up a little bit closer to the here and now? Because we think that's so far off, but it's actually, my dentist, he always says, cavities are like watching grass grow.
Oh, wow.
and it's like, you see the little precursor, and then 6 months later, you'll see like a tiny bit of movement. And it really is the cumulative, it's both the single session benefit, but the cumulative benefit of movement over time, that when you're in your 80s, you will feel that cumulative benefit of the regular exercise that you're doing.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
So what people want to know, okay, so what's the minimum? And what do I do? Should I be doing, just, to let the things that I've experimented with in terms of movement? I've been a long-term runner. I love to run, but in my 40s, I can't run in every day anymore. My knees won't allow for it. And I started taking up things like dance, and I love high intensity interval training because it's short and I can do it in a, like the working mom kind of, like I can do it in a very short period of time and feel like I got a really good bout of exercise. And I also am more and more interested in strength training as I age because of the impact on hormones and bones and all the muscle loss, all of that. So what is the minimum that people should be doing? What types of exercise have the best benefit for cognition? People want to know.
Yeah. So let me try to tease that apart a little bit. So I'm glad you brought up resistance training, because I hadn't mentioned that as yet. In addition to the evidence for the aerobic training, we do have evidence that strength training makes a difference in terms of preventing or delaying cognitive decline. And then also in terms of benefiting cognitive performance in whatever age group has been studied. So it's effective, just like aerobic is. A lot of people are excited about high intensity interval training. It's shown to have good cognitive benefits as well. We see benefits with Tai Chi and Qigong. If we ask people to self-report their physical activity, then as you can imagine, they'd be reporting a whole host of physical activities, just like the ones that you mentioned. Mm-hmm. And when they do that, we find that if we divide them into levels based on how physically active they are, the most active get the biggest cognitive benefit, and the least active get the least cognitive benefit. So what I would say is that at this point in time, we believe that it's pretty much a dose response kind of a situation, where if you do a little bit, you will get a little bit of benefit. If you do a little bit more, you will get a little bit more benefit. And that probably stays true until you reach some level that is sustainable and doesn't start to approach something like an overtraining scenario.
Right.
It probably plateaus. If you are somebody who is exercising a lot, I don't think increasing that by any amount is probably going to make a real difference, right? But being able to maintain that for the long term, keeping in mind that you want to prevent injuries or minimize the risk of injuries, keeping in mind that other things come up, either at work or in personal life, that might take you off that path, right? So I think finding, and you've already said this, Diana, but finding something that's sustainable for you is the first step. If that's a pretty low level of activity, then figuring out a way to increase it a little bit would be a great idea. Finding activities that you enjoy and that fit your lifestyle and that give you some flexibility, given other commitments, makes really great sense. And, and that's kind of it. I mean, that's the part that actually is truly beautiful. Like, it could be whatever it needs to be. I mean, here in North Carolina, it's leaf season. I spent 2 hours over the weekend blowing leaves. Right. And that's hard physical work. My back is still bothering me, but it was being outside and active for 2 hours and having an accomplishment, which felt good. And, it's a form of being physically active that's not sport and not exercise, but is an activity of daily living that helps contribute to an overall physically active lifestyle.
Right. And here in my house, it's compost digging.
Composting. Okay.
The digging and the compost which gets my back, but also is, beneficial for the whole family to get involved in.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that. And I'll give some tips to folks in terms of just, the behavioral science around how to create a habit around movement and how to set that up for yourself. But I like the idea that just a little bit more. And that, I don't know if you saw the study that came out on the 10,000 steps. That they were looking at, the recommendation for 10,000 steps, and where did that actually come from? And there wasn't really a science backing on it. It was from like the 1970s in Japan. Someone recommended it, and a group of researchers actually looked at how many steps is really beneficial, and it turned out to be closer to maybe 8,000. But the takeaway in terms of all-cause mortality. But the takeaway that they also said in that research study, and I'll link to it, I can't remember the authors of it right now, but was that 500 more steps a day. 500 more than what you're doing will have a benefit. So it's just increasing a little. And sometimes having that goal of I have to do an hour or it has to be some high intensity interval training workout that I complete can be a deterrent from just adding a little bit more in, adding something that's sustainable, doing what you enjoy, whether that's raking leaves or blowing leaves or digging compost. And then could you do a little bit more,
right.
you know, and paying attention to your body in terms of also it does need, you know, you don't want to get to the point of overtraining. I don't think that's the problem for most Americans.
No, that's true. That's true.
Well, you know, for those elite athletes, you know who you are. Take a rest.
That's right. That's right. Well, and what I'll say is too, you know, to the extent that it makes sense, engage the people around you in those physical activities because it just makes it all better, right? So you mentioned your mom walking with her best friend. So that makes it a commitment. It makes it more fun. It makes it a chance to socialize. We try to. We're not as good as it now as our kids have gotten older, but we for a long time were in a really good habit of doing family bike rides or family soccer or family pickleball on the weekends. And if we put the name family on it, then our kids understood that meant we were all going and that it was a commitment for the whole group. Yeah, it's a little bit forced, but my kids are really adept at a lot of different activities because we sort of made them do them, made the wrong word. We invited them to join us in doing activities that we enjoy from a young age so that they develop some skill sets that now give them the opportunity to join into almost any activity you can think of if given the chance.
And I would flip that also, engage in the activities that your children enjoy.
Yeah. Good.
You know,
Good.
Because a lot of times we don't like, you know, if my kids are just this past weekend, my kids wanted to go mountain biking out in this beautiful area over by the ocean called Moore Mesa. And for my husband and I, it was, we're going to walk out to, while you mountain bike out and we're walking while you're biking and we're participating in an activity that you enjoy, that you chose. And they love that too, you know, that it can go both ways. You know, when my kids play baseball, I watch their game, but I'm circling the field. I'm not sitting in those uncomfortable stands where you feel like you have to prop yourself up in seats for 2 hours. I'm walking the field. I'm stretching. I'm watching that I'm engaging in movement while they're engaging in movement. It doesn't have to be such a separate thing. And then that helps with the time management issue that parents have.
I've often thought that I wish that the club facility where my kids were playing soccer, you know, there are 20 fields out there. There are at least 20 practices, sometimes 40. I wish that the club would invest in an instructor to teach like a group calisthenics and exercise or get a group walking program going.
Right.
Instead of, like you said, all the parents just sitting on the sidelines for that hour and a half, whatever it is, when that could be the time that they're using to be physically active and to build community.
Yeah. I don't bring a chair to those things. I'm stretching, I'm walking, I'm squatting down, I'm getting in different positions to watch him. If he's in third base, I'm walking around to the third base. And in that way, at the end of those 2 hours, we've both moved. And then we both feel a little bit tired and we want to go like hang out and whatever. So that's the other thing about it is that we'll always lean to the more sedentary option. And it's become very socially, sort of more what's socially acceptable. I look like an oddball. Like standing there doing calf stretches. I'm willing to look like an oddball. I'm willing at this stage of my life.
I was there too. I just walk around all the fields and, you know, listen to music or a podcast or make a phone call or whatever, or just enjoy, you know, being out on a nice evening. Love that thought because even though you were walking and your kids were mountain biking, it's still the family doing it together because you're riding there together, you're riding home together, you're experiencing sort of the same environment. You have things to talk about. I mean, it's really almost a magical way of being physically active. And so I love that example.
Yeah. So we can get creative and find more magical ways of being physically active.
That's right.
For ourselves, for our kids, as we age, as older adults. And it doesn't have to be so, yes, prescriptives help, you know, but also you can get creative and flexible within those prescriptives. So thank you, Jenny. I'm excited to look for your research a year from now. What happens, I imagine, is going to be all the headlines and the big news. You're doing good work, and it's a lot of work and a long time to be working on a study like that. But I think it's going to have a big impact.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.